Hey everyone, this is FIDE Master Kostya Kavutskiy here for Chess.com, and today I wanted to start a new series here on YouTube talking about how to evaluate certain positions and the common mistakes that players often make when they want to evaluate a particular position. So basically the way it's going to work is that I'm going to have one or two examples every video, and the first thing I'll do is I'll ask you to evaluate it for yourself, draw some kind of conclusion, and then I'll give you the actual evaluation and we can discuss some of the common pitfalls and errors that players often make. The position you currently see on your board is the one we're going to be talking about today, and I want you guys to evaluate it if it was white to move. And while you're doing that, I'm going to give a bit of pros on some things that are important to think about in terms of general chess development. So the first thing I want to do is talk about the difference between a mistake in evaluation and a mistake in calculation. So let's say you're playing a game and you go for some forcing continuation. So you play one move, your opponent has a forced response. You play your second move, they have another forced response. And then you play your third move. And the position you get after your third move is the one that you've seen ahead of time in your calculations, and you judge that position to be good for you or much better or even winning, right? And then after you play your third move, your opponent suddenly plays some tactic that you missed or finds a fork or some small combination and you end up down a rook and you lose the game. So is that a mistake in evaluating the position? Not really. It's more of a mistake in calculation. Right? It wasn't some defect in your chess understanding, you simply overlooked some tactical operation or resource for your opponent. Now let's say that you played that same forcing operation in a different game, and after your third move, your opponent didn't have anything immediately concrete to win the game, but they played some natural moves, and your position ended up being worse. So that wasn't a mistake in calculation, that was a mistake in evaluation. It was an error in judgment, and you misunderstood some details in the position, right? Maybe you overestimated the power of something or underestimated the power of another factor in the position, right? So those are the kinds of situations that I want to talk about with this series, is how to correct and improve your evaluation skills so that whenever you do go towards a certain position that you're able to judge it correctly. And before we move on, I do want to say that evaluation is a really tough skill that even the best players in the world misevaluate positions all the time, right? But the better you are, then the more accurate and precise your evaluation can be. Okay, enough with that. Let's talk about this specific chess position in front of you. And if you need more time and you want to think about it more, then please do pause the video and continue thinking. Otherwise, we'll move on. And of course, when you're coming up with a conclusion for yourself about the evaluation of this position, think about who's better and by how much. So if white's better, for example, then is white completely winning? Black should resign. Is white clearly better? Or is white just slightly better? Meaning if black plays good defensive moves, then they will probably make a draw. Or is it equal in your mind, or is black better, or is black clearly better, completely winning? I think you get the idea. Okay, so now we'll move on to the actual evaluation of this position. Here we have a material imbalance, right? That's probably the first thing we should notice. White has a rook versus a knight and two pawns. So normally this would be equal in terms of the nominal material count. But since the pawns are doubled, then usually doubled pawns aren't worth as much as connected pawns, and thus that will lead us to believe that white has a slight material advantage. Okay, but what else should we notice about this position? Well, whenever we're playing with a rook against a knight or a bishop, the things you want to look for are whose pieces can get active and whose pieces can create more threats and develop more play. Well, in this case, white's rooks aren't doing a whole lot and don't have a whole lot of potential. White has two open files, the E file and the B file. So naturally the rooks would want to work there. If this rook goes to the E file, well, it's permanently blocked by this bishop on E6, which looks passive, but is actually doing a very good job of preventing White's rooks from getting active. And similarly, if the rook goes to B1, trying to activate itself on the B file, then Black can simply play rook B8. And White has no way of exploiting this pin. For example, rook C1, threatening rook C2, Black can just play bishop F5, and this rook has to go back in the corner. So that's no good for White, right? So seeing that White's pieces don't really have any kind of activity or potential for activity, that gives us a hint that this position might not be good for White, even though they have a material advantage. And by the way, this bishop on G2 is also not very good because it's pretty much, as they say, biting on granite on this D5 pawn, which is perfectly protected, perfectly solid, and that means that this bishop on G2 doesn't really have a whole lot to do either. So what about Black's position? Does Black have any sources of counterplay? Well, yeah. All Black has to do is just play king E7, king D6, and C5, and they're going to have two connected passed pawns in the center, which are going to be really strong. And honestly, there isn't really a way for White to stop this plan. So the actual evaluation of this position is that Black is clearly better, if not completely winning, because White's pieces can't get active, and Black in a few moves is going to create a couple of connected passed pawns in the center, which are going to be very strong. So let me show you how the game continued. This was taken from one of my own games. I was playing Black here. My opponent played rook FC1, rook B8, bishop F1, king E7, bishop E2, bishop F5, king F1, king D6, A4, rook B3. I'm simply activating all of my pieces and getting ready to push C5. So bishop D1, I gave a check. And although this bishop is bad, I decided to simply remove it from the board just to make things simpler for myself. Because now after C5, my king, rook, and bishop are all perfectly placed to support these pawns to advance and queen. And White is pretty much lost at this point because they have no play and no way of stopping my pawns. So rook E1, White wants to get some activity, and I could allow this. I can simply push the pawn and probably win the game, but I decided not to give my opponent any chances. And after rook A4, D4 would be a mistake because of rook E5 check, and White wins this pawn. But simply I played F6, taking away the E5 square, and my opponent decided to resign because he had no way of stopping these pawns from pushing and promoting. And again, my king, rook, and bishop are perfectly coordinated to support these pawns, and White is pretty much helpless. So what can we learn from this example? Well, the two typical mistakes I want to talk about that players probably make when they evaluate something like this is, first, they focus too much on the material count. A lot of times when players see a position where one side has an extra pawn, they just assume, oh, a pawn is a pawn and that's good enough for an advantage. They overlook the dynamic features of the position, like whose pieces are more active, who has the easier play, stuff like that. The second mistake is that players often underestimate their opponent's resources. In this case, if you're looking at it from White's side, you might only try to figure out a way for White to get active play or to create some threats, and you might have completely overlooked or underestimated Black's simple counterplay of bringing their king to the center and playing c5 and getting these two incredibly strong passed pawns. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this lecture, and we will continue with evaluating complex positions in the future. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'll see you around on Chess.com.